We talk about inequality being such a big issue, but inequality is the other side of the fact that the concentration of wealth is unlike anything any generation in this world has ever seen. The fact that private wealth has more resourcing for a global agenda or a climate agenda or a COVID agenda than any public institutions. It's the scariest scenario for this generation and future generations to live in.
Greetings, good people. I'm Kumi Naidu, and you're listening to Power, People and Planet, a series of candid conversations with activists and community leaders from around the world, aiming to tackle the biggest questions of our time. What's race and inequality got to do with climate change? Is our current economic and political system even capable of restoring nature or tackling inequality? And how do we start to rebuild trust, even a new social contract between citizens and people in power? Today, we are very pleased to be speaking with Lysa John, the Secretary General of CIVICUS, World Alliance for Citizen Participation. Lysa was born in Mumbai, India, where she started out building grassroots campaigns around urban poverty, governance, and housing rights. Since then, she has worked with Save the Children International and as the head of outreach for the UN high-level panel on the Sustainable Development Goals. And today she describes herself as a relentless enabler of activism. I had the pleasure and honor of meeting Lysa when she was one of the leaders of the campaign in India, which I think I'm going to say it wrong now, known as Vadana Todo, which means don't break your promises, which was part of the global call to action against poverty, and which she eventually ended up heading it globally. Lysa, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm expecting a lot of difficult questions so that it is truly catalytic.
No, I don't think it'll be difficult, but what we want is to try and pose some questions that will hopefully help listeners to understand the very delicate moment we are in human history. But let's go back to your early activism. You started out as a grassroots community organizer in Mumbai, and I believe you were in a youth organization that was actually a member of CIVICUS at some point based in Mumbai, which Minar Pimple was part of. Is that correct?
It is correct, yes.
What was the name of that youth organization?
It's YUVA, Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action. Yes.
That's right. I remember Yuva. Yuva was a very active member of CIVICUS. So it's really wonderful to see somebody who was in a member organization at the grassroots level in one city of India becoming the head of CIVICUS globally. So tell me how you first got involved in that activism. What was your trigger, and what motivated you at the outset? Because this question is a key question of our time, I feel, which is to understand what are the triggers for people to say, I'm going to get involved, I'm going to do something, I'm part of the solution. What was it for you at a young age?
So thanks for framing the journey in that way. I've actually never thought about it like that, but it is a really interesting way of thinking of the last 22 plus years of my time in civil society. So I think for me, the trigger actually is probably not as as outward as or as linked to an issue as most people it tends to be. It's much more personal in terms of the fact that I actually studied in one of the most elite schools in India, and that was thanks to my mother basically diverting most of her income towards ensuring that her only daughter got the best education she could afford. Both my parents actually were unemployed by the time I was 15 years old. So I know my entire university life was a choice between either having lunch or taking, walking to at least an hour to reach the nearest train station. So, so I think for me, just the opposite kind of environments I was in when I was growing up, where on one hand, I had the privilege of going to a school. I mean, that was the time that my parents were employed. So I had the privilege of going to a school, but also seeing that, feeling very, very, excluded or left out, because most of my classmates came from very, very affluent families where, of third generation professionals or doctors or people who had visited countries abroad, had all of these kind of material possessions that, you couldn't even dream of. And you were kind of like just feeling like the least important person in the room. And then suddenly moving, I think, into my university days, where I studied for 5 years in colleges of social work, which then put you out into communities which had far greater challenges than you had, but you could connect very closely to that sense of being of not having equal opportunity. And I think that's really been the key theme that's really kept me in civil society, because no matter which socio-economic background you belong to, you're always going to have an experience of discrimination, even if you're a woman from the wealthiest country in the world, or you're a person of color, or a Black person in the richest country of the world. There's always going to be some element of your identity which allows you to connect with the essence of inequity, of discrimination, of the fact that there just has to be more ways for people to access the same level of opportunity and opportunity to progress, irrespective of who they are. And I think on the flip side of that, also appreciating that no matter where you come from, you also enjoy certain privileges. So for me, when I got into university and I was studying social work, I used to work with street populations, pavement dwellers, even people. I mean, I worked in a de-addiction center actually for street youth as well. And just the flip change in that moment of feeling like the most deprived person in school, but then suddenly realizing that even the fact that I was in an English medium school in one of the most elite schools in India was a privilege that so few people in that country can actually afford. And suddenly I was the elite in that space, right? And I think so it kind of really begs the responsibility for all of us to just be aware that there's always two facets of how power and privilege interact. I mean, you interact with power and privilege, and it's being very conscious of the fact that there are some spaces in which you will be the least powerful, but there are going to be many spaces where you are going to be very, very powerful, and being able to be more attentive to that, and then being able to be very intentional about how you then exercise your influence or claim your agency is what life essentially is all about, right? Even beyond civil society.
Yeah, that's really well put. And as you said those words, I realized that that resonates with my experience of there are certain situations where you're deeply disempowered, and then there are certain, like in my case, just the fact that I'm a man in many situations puts me in a position of power. And when I think of my activism, over a long period of time, that certainly resonates. Lysa, can you just reflect a little bit about what lessons did you learn from your grassroots work, and how does your background shape your present approach? What inspired you to act, and what's changed since those early days?
So I think that's where my experience with Yuva as the first kind of role I played comes in, because Yuva's work, even though it was a youth organization by definition, it was actually much broader than just youth issues. It was about catalyzing the energy and the obsession with reform and transformative change that young people have, but in mainstream policy making. So all of the issues that we worked in were housing rights, urban development, urban governance. I mean, really mainstream issues, but bringing a much more activist kind of energy and perspective to it. So I would say there were three takeaways from that. I worked there for 8 years in Mumbai, and the work was relevant to beyond Mumbai. It was national, it was global. There were lots of interconnecting kind of entry points. But the three kind of key takeaways was, one, there should not be a single person in civil society who has not experienced direct interaction with a community that actually reflects the direct impact of the issues they work with. And in later iterations of my role, I find it kind of shocking, but also painful that we get new people into our organizations who have never had a chance to interact with the community that represents the issues that they're advocating for. And I think that really completely undermines the legitimacy as well as the sustainability of our efforts, because if we cannot emotionally connect and we cannot experientially connect with the impact of the issues we're working on, when it's always going to be a cerebral and somewhat tokenistic exercise, the kind of challenges we face, the threats we face, a lot of the risks that we take, they can't be rationalized. They have to come from a much deeper place of, feeling passionately about the issue, feeling, really feeling the pain as well as the courage of people who face those issues and the impact of those issues on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's really has to be the driving force, whether it's a global organization or a regional organization. I mean, as leaders of organizations, we have to be able to connect and make that experience available to everybody who is part of civil society. The second really is that there is no alternative to alliances and there's no alternative to solidarity. And that actually requires experiences on the other end of the spectrum. So on one hand, I'm saying that, you really need to be connected to how issues impact, the most vulnerable or most excluded communities in a very real, personal, human way. But on the other hand, you have to have the ability to articulate those same experiences and issues to segments of society, or especially, more powerful segments of society who have no experience of those issues. And it means that you're able to, have the nuance or the complexity to not personalize problems, but continuously remember that the fight is against institutions, it's not against people. So if you're not able to, if you engage, farmers or fish workers or urban poor settlements, but you're not able to sit in a municipal office or in a national government department or a politician's office and build a case for why that long-term investment or policy change is needed, then I think you've failed as an advocate, right? Because you've really not been able to bridge the gap, and you've really not been able to bring together the allies who are needed for a more deeper and a more long-term change. And one of the questions I like asking, well, maybe myself and a lot of colleagues I work with, is that if you don't have friends who work beyond the kind of organization that you already work in, you're actually only you're only kind of representing 1/4 of the change, the force for change that you need. And in a lot of my work, including in Vadana Todo Abhiyan, I think was really powerful because my day-to-day job was meeting people who knew nothing about NGOs and they knew nothing about civil society. So I had to keep meeting, whether it was school children or it was, politicians or parliamentarians, people who would say, oh, you're the first person from an NGO I've ever met. And I think that's the beauty of, the other end of the spectrum in terms of solidarity. We should continuously be talking to people who don't know anything about what we do, and then making friends and making allies, of them. And that's where I think, that's where movements like Me Too or the climate movement have been really powerful, because they've brought people together and on an intergenerational, transnational, sectoral basis to focus on a shared outcome or purpose.
Now, I want to take you back to the first thing you said, right? And I'm going to be a bit provocative here. When you correctly identify some of the shortcomings of the very organizations that seek to serve, and they have a lot of diversity deficits, if you want. I just wanted to say that as you were saying it, I saw two problems. One was how, in fact, when we look at the global NGO scene, how, in fact, northern NGOs, or what we call international NGOs, still don't reflect anything like what the world looks like. In fact, a mutual colleague of ours, Salil Shetty, when he was head of Amnesty and I was head of Greenpeace, came to visit with his team. And he said, Kumi, I've just come to realize why all the international NGOs have international at the end of the name, Save the Children International, Greenpeace International, Oxfam International, Amnesty International. And he said, because we're trying to mask how uninternational we actually are, right? And I mean, the evidence is there. You just have to go and look at the profile of power in these institutions and who control it. And as I have said publicly, taking somebody like me from the global south and plonking at the top of the organization doesn't address the diversity question at all. But there's another part of it, right? So that one is a little bit easier to see. How much of a problem is it that in many countries in the global south, that the NGO community attracts people mainly from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds, because the nature of the funding, the nature of the educational expectations that people have to have, because they have to be able to deal with, logical framework approach, planning methods that, one day, the European Union and countries in Europe are pushing. So if you want to get money, So when you reflect on it, do you think, how much of work do you think we need to do inside of civil society to get our house in order?
Okay, so I think the two elements of that question, one in terms of the composition of the civil society workforce, especially at higher levels, I think, and then second is really in terms of the northern dominance in international civil society, and then therefore the fact that organizations aren't really international. They actually represent certain regions or certain groupings of countries that are anyway more dominant in the global landscape. And I think for both of those, I would say that all the organizations we have are a representation of how resources and power is distributed in the world anyway, right? And I think, I feel like there's been a lot of outspokenness, including, the letter from Rustlers Valley that you were part of initiating and signing. But it's really time now for, at least in my conversations now on INGO reform, I say that, there's nothing left to be said now. Everybody knows what to do. If you're not doing it, then you are deliberately making a choice not to change. And there's nothing more that we can do from the Global South to kind of encourage you to get there. So it's much better for us to then just conserve our own energies and resources and use it to catalyze and wane and enable other forms of civil society to flourish rather than kind of get fixated on the more traditional forms. But having said that, I think for a lot of large international organizations, again, it's really them being caught up in their own resourcing structures. And having worked in some of those organizations, I think just the fact that the resourcing of that organization, the definition of success being how much money you've raised for your work on a year-to-year basis, is kind of a vicious circle, right? And it's really hard to emerge from that if from your board to your CEO to your senior leadership, that's the definition of whether the organization is doing well or not. And I usually give the example of Civicus, where I think we're one of the few organizations in the world where we almost have a cap on growth, where the board is extremely clear that we're not here to build an empire, a Civicus empire. We're here to serve other parts of civil society. So there should not be, it's great to have some level of growth, but we do not want to be the largest, at least financial entity working on civic space, and that's not where our direction of travel is. So we should always be the largest network of activists. We should always be large in our impact and our scope of work. But if the finances aren't kind of growing rapidly on an annual basis, that's not something everybody is going to have a panic attack about. And I feel really privileged to be one of the fewest CEOs and leaders in the world who doesn't have to worry about how
growth.
Exactly. And I remember being in one webinar just after COVID had kind of escalated last year. There were 35 CEOs in that meeting, and I was the only person whose board was not on my case saying, how is this going to impact our resource base? And so for me, I had all of the mental energy to just look at what we were doing, change things, co-create with teams and communities without having to write reams of papers and kind of try and figure out how we're actually going to be protecting our balance sheet or financial lines as a result of COVID. And I think that kind of, poverty of attention is created by governance structures of such organizations. So it's easy to target the CEO or the senior leadership and say they're the ones not doing enough, but there's an entire structure created to imprison that organization in that kind of frame of thinking. And that's why I think the work with boards and as well is a really important, and donors, because these are the two kind of engines that drive the character of an organization is so much more important going forward.
I fully agree with that. Would you agree with the fact that if many of the organizations we mentioned who are in the international NGO space would say that the United Nations and the World Bank and IMF and so on are stuck in the geopolitics of 1945, in terms of how power in the world looked like at that time? I think that's the same thing we could say about international NGOs. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I don't think the UN is stuck in the 1945. It's done at least some useful things, but I would absolutely agree that most of the global institutions are still playing off a very outdated and completely redundant kind of playbook in terms of how change and influencing happens. And a big part of that is a very narrow understanding of what resourcing means. If you look at all of the movements that have happened in the last one decade, they've been spontaneous movements which haven't received the traditional kind of funding and resourcing that most formal civil society is caught up in. And in fact, for Civicus itself, I've mentioned this in a few conversations before, that we've tripled our membership in the last 3 years. Most of our members, in fact, 70% of them do not belong to organizations. Like they engage with multiple networks and movements. They're not professional NGO workers, but they believe in issues. They have a very, very, kind of rigorous understanding of justice and of change, which is kind of all permeating, right? So they're kind of being able to engage with issues beyond just their kind of career or work life. And they're able to then, I think, activate a lot more support systems in terms of their own neighborhood or their friends and their other kind of online and offline systems and circles, which we used to be really good at doing as civil society, but have kind of somehow got, cornered into looking at more inward looking or more kind of short-term issues. And there again, I would not blame it on civil society organizations themselves. I would blame it on the resourcing patterns, because the way that civil society resourced is deliberately intended to keep us away from acting on long-term radical issues, because you're threatened with your resources being taken away, your registration being taken away. So all of the civic space restrictions that tools like the Civicus Monitor throw up are actually a long-term pattern of disabling civic action, of ensuring that the public scrutiny or the ability for communities and citizens at large to hold both governments and businesses accountable is being deliberately downgraded. It's being deliberately dismantled, and civil society's so-called inefficiencies or kind of inability to deliver is just the excuse. It's just the smokescreen for this larger project of just allowing vested interests to just get away with what they're doing.
Now, I want to just go back to the UN being stuck in the geopolitics of 1945. That phrase, those words actually were articulated the first time I heard it, and I've then used it 1,000 times after I heard it the first time. I heard it from Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General of the United Nations. And I was at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, or Rio Plus 10 in Joburg. And, we were asking questions about the inequality of power at the Security Council. So I would argue that in some ways the UN is worse today than it was in 1945, because today, on the one hand, the governance of the UN is still stuck in the geopolitics of 1945. What I mean by that is, why is France and Britain having a veto on the Security Council, for example, right? Because they are modest-sized countries, 60, 70 million. The only reason they're there is because they were on the right side of the Second World War. and they are so civilized that they have nuclear weapons, right? But if we use the nuclear weapon, sort of, if you own nuclear weapons, then you have to be on the Security Council. Then, of course, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and so on, all should be on the Security Council. So basically, I believe the UN and World Bank and IMF suffer from four deficits: a democratic deficit, a coherence deficit, a compliance deficit, and an accountability deficit. Now, within the UN, the international governance system, of course, I'll agree with you, the UN is the lesser of the evils. But today, the corporate influence of the United Nations is of quite big concern, don't you think?
Sure. And I'm also going to respond to the earlier part of your statement. So I definitely would say that the Security Council is messed up big time, and for all the reasons you mentioned. But having been part of the process that led to the Sustainable Development Goals, I think there are processes or opportunities within the UN that have really taken off. The SDGs, I mean, the 2030 agenda is the most ambitious, intergovernmental agenda. The fact that you had so many governments from the global north and south really taking ownership and agency of the principles and the end outcomes of that, I think it was almost it's hard to believe that something like that could happen now. The Human Rights Council, with whom we engage very, very actively, continues to be a space for hope where civil society is treated equally with governments. There is a voice for it. So it's always I think tactically depending on what you're going after and which stakeholder you're talking to, it's good to have both views on hand, because I feel like the UN 75 campaign that we're part of as well, we've made some very, very strong demands for the opening up of the UN to direct civic participation. So this includes the World Citizens Initiative or Parliamentary Assembly of the UN, and the ability to actually think of different ways in which the UN would work is possible only if you have at least 1% of hope that they're making a difference, right? So while agreeing that the resourcing, the decision making is completely skewed, it's almost criminal that we can allow an institution of such importance to operate in the way that it does now. I think that it's also important for the UN to have some very, very vocal champions of the essence of what it represents, and therefore not allow actually the factors who are undermining that essence to feel like they have complete power and can just get away with whatever they're doing. And I think that fight, of course, the climate movement has been really strong in pushing that forward as well. And we know that as countries, as governments change and as things evolve politically, in depending on the leadership of countries, there's a different opportunity for new narratives, right? So the real work actually in terms of UN reforms is the work again on the ground of electing the right kind of leaders at the national and subnational levels who understand the interdependence of issues and who don't think that global solidarity is an afterthought. And I think that's the work of really reforming the UN in terms of making that connection between the choices that we make for our leaders on the ground and how they then behave on the global stage. But having said that, I've now forgotten the second question, so you'll have to remind me.
Are you concerned, as some people are, that big corporations over the last two decades have come to exercise a bit too much of influence over UN decision-making and the programs of the UN?
So I think that's completely true. And I honestly feel like the biggest challenge of our times is just the influence and the consolidation of extreme wealth. I mean, we talk about inequality being, such a big issue, but inequality is the other side of the fact that the concentration of wealth is unlike anything any generation in this world has ever seen. The fact that private wealth has more resourcing for a global agenda or a climate agenda or a COVID agenda than any public institutions, and is able to then manipulate how, the level of access, whether it is to the vaccine or to any other kind of form of support. It's the scariest, I think, scenario for, this generation and future generations to live in. And I think we haven't, as civil society, really caught up with that angle. So that, we do have some excellent research and kind of advocacy on extreme wealth and inequality, but we don't have still a connected movement the way that we had when the global call to action against poverty was operating, which is really able to call out issues of tax evasion, tax justice, of recalibrating this ridiculously disproportionate way in which wealth is being hoarded and utilized. So I think just a few weeks ago when you had the space tourism launches at a time when most countries were not even able to access the vaccine or afford the vaccine. I mean, it's completely ridiculous that we live in a time like this. And I think that's the key issue that civil society really needs to get grips with, come to terms with, and start heavily investing in. I know within Civicus we're talking now about like really exploring the relationship between civic space and inequality, also civil society and private wealth, and just the fact that we keep directing all of our efforts to governments, but those governments have been heavily compromised and are being controlled by private interests, but we're not really getting then to that part of the story and being much more, I think, aggressive in our efforts to expose such entities.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you more on that. I just realized, one of the things that people, errors maybe people like you and me make is that we always sort of think that some of the language we use is always easily understood by everybody. And one of the jargon that is still not understood, if I walked out in the streets of Joburg, where you also live, and if we walked out together and started asking people on the street, what is civil society? What is civil society? So just define it for our listeners. What is civil society for you, and why is it important?
So I think if I was out on the street, the phrase I would really use would be public participation and public scrutiny, and that everybody understands. I mean, everybody understands that you need to have active networks or active groups of people. I'm using citizens in a very loose term because a lot of people are stateless and are migrants and refugees, but you do have to have an active group of people to continue to play that watchdog role, to continue to scrutinize what governments and businesses are doing, and that everybody understands. I mean, everybody across the world, no matter where they live, know that if power is allowed to play without any form of accountability, it's almost always going to be a negative force. It's almost always going to get away with taking away resources from those who need it the most. And I think that's the role that civil society, again, in all its diversity, not just formal organizations, but also movements and networks and self-help groups and bloggers and any kind of network that is speaking up on behalf of people on behalf of publics basically, and asking for access to better information, more answers about how resources are being utilized or decisions are being made, represents civil society. And the reason why, for instance, being a journalist now is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world is, again, because there is a deliberate project of vilifying civil society. There is a deliberate project of dismantling all types of democratic oversight mechanisms, because people want to get away with the kind of crimes against public interest that are taking place across the world. So every country which has a downward grade or a downward trajectory on civic freedoms is basically a country where vested interests are making sure that there is no public scrutiny of their actions. And I think that's the way we need to see and understand the way that civil society is allowed to exist or not. And again, like I said earlier, the arguments are made in terms of civil society being foreign agents and anti-national forces and anti-economic forces. This is just a smoke screen, because essentially what's happening is that it's a push against any kind of citizen, any kind of person having access to the information that they should rightfully have in order to know what's happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. When some of our leaders in the global south say if an NGO receives money from outside, of the country, then they are foreign agents or acting in foreign interests. If you go with that definition, receiving money from a non-national entity, then all our governments are foreign agents, and all our governments in the global south are sort of agents in that sense. But, I want to just say that I was really pleased to hear you say that 75% of the members of CIVICUS right now are more part of what we could call informal, less organized civil society. I don't want to say unorganized because there is organization there, right? Less organized versus the more formalized, bureaucratized civil society. Because when I was at CIVICUS, the focus was more on institutions and organizations. How do you see the tension between, if you want, the more formalized expressions of civil society versus the more informal expressions of civil society? Because, if you look at the movements that really have shifted narrative, that have, like, for example, on inequality, if it wasn't for the Occupy movement, right, which was completely organic, decentralized, leaderful, bureaucratic. I'm not saying that it didn't have challenges, but it was able to shift the narrative on inequality, and contributed quite strongly to laying a good foundation for that work to go ahead. If we look at young people in the climate movement and Fridays for the Future, for example, they are not organized in the ways that, you and I grew up organizing things. They can use social media, they can connect and so on. So how do you see this tension playing out? And from the role you have now, is it a concern for you? Is it a frustration for you? Is it something that you have to think about? Does it keep you awake at night?
It keeps me awake during the day, at least. But I think it's a beautiful tension, because the more people you have who are beyond the structures of formal civil society, the more the appetite for challenging hierarchies, challenging leadership, established leadership kind of systems and structures within organizations is, and therefore the more freedom there is to think, radically out of the box, because everybody is a thought leader in their own right. I mean, no matter what designation you come in with and which organization you work from, you're exactly the same. You're an equal in terms of the thinking environment as anyone else in the room. And I think that's been so liberating. In fact, I'm now so used to that in CIVICUS that I find it really hard to attend other meetings, because I just find that the ability to just have a free-flowing conversation where you're building on each other's ideas, you're thinking, beyond just your own immediate experience and organizational kind of framework is so rich. And I think that's what has driven, the impact and the dynamism of many of the national, subnational, and global movements we've seen in recent years. In fact, there was an activist from Hong Kong actually who put it really well and said that the media keeps calling the Hong Kong movement a leaderless movement, but we are not leaderless, we're actually leaderful, because we recognize that every single person has a role to play. And I think that appreciation and genuine respect of the agency that individuals bring, and the ability to create like tools and templates and language that anyone can adapt and contextualize to their own setting is something we have to learn, or we are just going to disappear. I think from, in terms of organized civil society, we're just not going to be relevant anymore, because the kind of scale at which the issues exist right now, there is not going to be enough resourcing to respond in a kind of a paid engagement type of framework.
Absolutely.
It has to just go beyond that. And I think self-serving resourcing, where your resourcing is all about preserving your organizational structures and systems and influence, is just not cutting it anymore. I mean, nobody appreciates that kind of behavior. So I think, organizations are going to really be challenged to say, I was saying this in another conversation today, that, in any civil society organization, other than if you're working in a technical department like HR and finance, 80% of a person's time has to be outward facing. And any organization that demands that, the maximum of their personnel's time should be on internal issues, talking to their own colleagues. I've been in some organizations where I've actually said, if I'm spending my entire day talking to people who are employed by the same organization, then I'm in the wrong place. I mean, this is just not what we're here for. And I think that is going to be a challenge that people are going to face, because the idea that we have all the answers, that our research is going to bring up all of the analysis we're ever going to need to figure out the next 10 years of our strategy, that's just completely redundant, right? I mean, COVID kind of shook up everything and nobody even saw it coming. So I think,
So
go ahead, yeah.
no. So let's just move to COVID. You wrote an amazing, powerful piece where, in reflecting of the government's responses, you said, and I quote, "The present system is not merely broken, but deliberately malevolent." Can you tell us what you mean by that?
So I think it's a bit of what we spoke about earlier about, there's been that the intent now is to rob people of their civic freedoms, of their ability to hold public institutions and private institutions accountable, and it's not happening by accident. I think just the fact that we're in the midst of the worst pandemic we've seen in a century or more, and we have all of the resources, all of the means, all of the lessons, all of the experiences needed for a universal response, but it's just not happening because people don't want it to happen, or people in power don't want it to happen, or countries that hold resources don't want to share their resources. It's just a complete failure, I think, then of current leadership and of institutions, and it's a failure to act in the interest of publics. But definitely, I think a mindset which has which now actually makes it okay for people to just act in their own self-interest. I mean, it's ridiculous. Both of us have been part of GCAP and the Make Poverty history. At that point, we were still talking about global solidarity, about aid, and how aid needs to be directed to it's a reparation process, and it's not like charity or something you're doing that which is like an add-on or a good to have. And the fact that now, so many years later, we're still in the same position where the natural instinct of a national government is to protect itself rather than recognize the interdependence of the solution. It just feels like there's a deliberate ignorance or a deliberate posturing, which is only serving again the elite and making them richer. We've seen again the Oxfam report, which says that the 10 richest people, the kind of profits they made just during the course of the pandemic would have been enough to afford vaccines and social protection for every single person in the world. So I think again, and it's even more scary because you have all of the media organizations basically being owned by the same kind of vested interests. So in most countries, you do not actually get to know what's happening, or you're being deliberately pushed into or pushed to consume a kind of analysis or a glorification of, again, extreme wealth and completely irresponsible power, because the channels that we used to depend on to tell us what was happening in the world have all kind of just been corrupted, and therefore I think there's a huge need for us to again have our ears on the ground, because only when we're out there experiencing what change is happening, through the interventions of many transnational communities, is when we get a real sense of where the possibilities for transformation exist.
Thank you very much for that response. Unfortunately, we've come to the last question. It went so fast. I got so many more that I want to ask you. But do you think, though, that the profiteering and the inequality that you described so eloquently, right? And people have been describing what we have now is disaster capitalism. That when we have things like COVID, there are people who are making a killing out of it, making huge amounts of profit around it, right? And inequality itself gets entrenched. But all of this, would you agree that shows clearly that the social contract isn't broken, right? As many people say now, oh, the contract isn't broken, by which we mean the commitment of governments to their citizens, or the relationship between the government to the citizens, right? But it seems that it isn't broken, but it's actually working very well, in the sense that it's working as intended. If that's the case, what can we do about it?
So the social contract is working well because it's benefiting those who basically hold the reins of those public or private institutions, and then are making it work for themselves. I think where the social contract is now non-existent is in the ability of communities or individuals to actually expect anything from those kind of institutions or those roles, right? And in many of the cases we've seen of judicial activism, it's less about the structures of judiciary and more about that one judge who's in that constitutional court or in some other space, who's on whom the faith of the entire publics of a nation depends. And that's the kind of situation we've reached now, where all of these systems have just have been deliberately made so redundant that it's almost impossible to find any one space where you could even moderately believe that there will be a good outcome that comes out of this.
Lysa John, thank you for your work, for your journey, for all the things you've done from Mumbai. And I'm very pleased that you've landed up in my home city, Johannesburg, even though I'm not very pleased that we still haven't had a chance to have a cup of coffee together because of the pandemic and so on. But let's hope the Delta variant goes down here somewhat in Gauteng and I'm able to see you face to face. Thank you so much, and do convey my best wishes to your colleagues at CIVICUS. Thank you very, very much.
Of course, Kumi. Thank you for inviting me here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Power, People and Planet. The show is produced in association with the Green Economy Coalition, one of the world's biggest global alliances fighting for green and fair economies. We would love your help to spread the message of this podcast and the conversations within, so please do follow us and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.